The millionaire married a waitress to fulfill his will, a sentence that filled the front pages of every magazine in New York the week Daniel Hawthorne made the most inexplicable decision of his life. To the public, it was an act of arrogance or madness. To Daniel, it was a transaction. To her, it was survival. Neither of them imagined it would become something neither money nor power could control. That morning, the city pulsed with winter rain. Inside the penthouse office of Hawthorne Industries, Daniel stood before the towering glass window, staring down at a skyline that looked like it belonged to someone else. The air around him carried the sterile chill of success, the kind that smelled like marble, leather, and emptiness. At 36, he had everything a man could own: a chain of tech companies, a fleet of cars, and enough wealth to outlive a dozen generations. Yet in the silence of his empire, there was something hollow, something that no acquisition could fill. Behind him, his attorney, Harold, cleared his throat. "The clause is clear, Daniel. You can't inherit your father's final trust unless you're married before your 37th birthday. That's next week." Daniel didn't turn. "So I marry someone. Anyone. You'll draw up the papers." "Anyone?" Harold asked, incredulous. "Preferably someone who understands the meaning of discretion." He turned then, eyes sharp but tired. There was a faint scar near his temple, a reminder from a car crash years ago, the one that took his mother and carved the first crack in his armor. Since then, Daniel had perfected the art of control. He never lost. Not in business, not in life, but control, he was beginning to realize, was a lonely kingdom. Meanwhile, across the city, Emily Carter was balancing a tray of coffee cups and late orders in a small diner that smelled like butter and rain-soaked coats. She'd been working double shifts for months to cover her mother's medical bills. Every tip mattered. Every smile was effort. She was smart, far more than her uniform revealed, but life hadn't given her much room to dream. Her eyes held warmth, the kind that made strangers feel seen, but behind it was quiet exhaustion. Table 4's waiting," called her co-worker. "I'm on it," she said, adjusting her apron and forcing another smile. That was when the door opened, and the rain walked in with Daniel Hawthorne. He didn't belong there, not among chipped coffee mugs and flickering neon lights. He wore a dark overcoat, his presence too commanding for a room that smelled of pancakes. People turned to look, sensing money the way animals sense storms. Emily looked up from the counter just as he took a seat by the window. "Coffee," he said without glancing at the menu. His voice was deep, calm, the kind that made people obey before they realized they had. She poured it for him, steady despite the weight of his gaze when he finally met her eyes. They were steel gray, detached but not cruel, just used to not feeling anything. "You're new here," he said. 2 years, she replied. "So, technically, not that new." He almost smiled, surprised by her tone. "You talk to all your customers like that?" "Only the ones who look like they could use it," she said lightly, turning to go. It was the first genuine thing he'd heard in months. When she walked away, he watched her reflection in the glass. There was something disarmingly real about her, the way she moved without pretense, the way she didn't treat him like a man who could buy the world. He left a $100 bill beneath his cup when he finished, but she chased him out into the rain. "Excuse me," she called, holding out the bill. "You overpaid." He turned, rain sliding off his coat. "Consider it a tip for a $5 coffee?" "For your honesty," he said. She stared at him, brow furrowed. "You think that's rare?" "I think it's expensive." He walked away before she could answer. 2 days later, Emily was called into the manager's office. "There's a man asking for you," her boss said, eyes wide. "Said his name's Hawthorne." Daniel was waiting at the corner booth again, the raincoat gone, his suit immaculate. "Sit," he said simply, and for reasons she couldn't explain, she did. "I have a proposition," he began, his tone businesslike. "You need money. I need a wife." She blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "A legal arrangement," he continued, unbothered by her shock. "Marriage in name only. You'll be compensated well. 1 year. Then we part ways." "You can't be serious," she said, half laughing. "I don't joke about contracts." She stared at him, trying to read the man behind the words. "Why me?" "Because you don't want anything from me," he said quietly. "That's rare." For a long moment, she said nothing. The weight of her debts pressed against her chest like a hand she couldn't push away. He was offering everything she needed, and everything she swore she'd never sell. "What happens if I say yes?" she asked softly. "Then your life changes," he said, "immediately. And if I say no?" "Then mine doesn't," he said, but his eyes betrayed something else. She stood, shaking her head. "You're out of your mind." Probably, he said, sliding a card across the table. But think about it. That night she couldn't sleep. The ceiling of her small apartment seemed to press down on her. Her mother's medicine sat half empty on the nightstand. The electricity bill was due. And that card, Daniel Hawthorne, private number, burned on her dresser like temptation itself. She picked it up at 2 a.m. and stared at it for a long time before dialing. "Hello?" His voice was low, alert, as if he'd been waiting. "I'll do it," she said. He was silent for a moment, then, "I'll have my attorney draw up the papers." When she hung up, Emily sat in the dark, the phone still in her hand. She didn't know it yet, but that single call had just rewritten both their lives. Subscribe if you believe that love still changes people. The rain outside eased into silence, but inside her, a storm had just begun. 3 days later, Emily found herself standing in the marble lobby of Hawthorne Industries, the sound of her worn shoes echoing too loudly against the polished floor. She had never been anywhere like it. The space was vast, sterile, and intimidating, lined with glass, chrome, and men who walked as if gravity didn't touch them. She kept her chin lifted, trying to hide how out of place she felt, but her heart was pounding. The receptionist glanced at her skeptically before speaking into her earpiece. "Ms. Carter has arrived." A moment later, a young woman in a tailored grey suit appeared. "Mr. Hawthorne is expecting you," she said curtly, leading Emily toward a private elevator. When the doors opened, Daniel was standing at the far end of a minimalist office that looked more like a museum than a workspace. The skyline of Manhattan stretched behind him like a painted backdrop. He didn't look up immediately. When he did, his expression was unreadable. "You came," he said simply. "I said I would." He gestured to the seat across from his desk. "Sit." On the table was a thick folder, a pen, and a glass of water placed perfectly parallel to the edge. Everything about him was measured, precise, as though emotion was something he'd long ago outgrown. "You've read the terms?" he asked. "I tried," she admitted. "There's a lot of legal language I don't understand." He nodded slightly. "That's why I asked Harold to explain it." The attorney, the same man from before, stepped forward and adjusted his glasses. "It's straightforward, Ms. Carter. A 1-year civil marriage. You'll live with Mr. Hawthorne for the duration. Your personal needs will be fully covered. Upon completion, you'll receive the agreed amount. No further obligations." Emily hesitated. "And what does he get?" Daniel met her eyes. "My father's trust fund and silence." She exhaled slowly. "So this is really about money." "It's always about money," he said, with a hint of bitterness she didn't expect. When she didn't answer, he added more softly, "You'll be safe. I don't hurt people, Emily, I just don't get close to them." Her fingers tightened around the pen. "You don't even know me." "That's the point," he said. Something in his tone, quiet, almost weary, made her look up. For a brief second, the mask slipped. There was loneliness in him, sharper than any arrogance she'd imagined. She signed. The pen moved across paper, and just like that, the world shifted. When she set it down, he extended his hand. "Congratulations, Mrs. Hawthorne." The word Mrs. hit harder than she expected. She shook his hand, her pulse racing. His grip was firm, his skin warm, but there was no pretense of affection, only formality. Harold gathered the documents. "The ceremony will be private. No press, no guests. Tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow," she said, startled. Daniel gave a faint, humorless smile. No point dragging it out. When she left his office, the city felt different, louder, colder. She stopped at a bakery window and stared at the rows of wedding cakes, their perfect white frosting mocking the reality of what she'd just agreed to. Back at her apartment, her mother noticed the silence in her daughter's movements. What is it?" Emily forced a smile. "I just made a big decision." Her mother took her hand. "As long as it's one that doesn't cost you your peace, sweetheart." That night, Emily lay awake again, staring at the ceiling. She wasn't sure peace was something she could afford anymore. The next morning, a black car arrived to take her to a courthouse uptown. She wore a simple cream dress she already owned. It wasn't a wedding gown, but it felt symbolic enough. When she stepped out, Daniel was waiting immaculate as ever in a charcoal suit. He looked at her once, expression unreadable. "You look appropriate," he said, which was the closest thing to a compliment he knew how to give. "Thanks," she said dryly. "You really know how to make a girl feel special." His lips almost curved into a smile, but not quite. Inside, the ceremony was quick. A few signatures, a brief exchange of vows that neither spoke with conviction, and the quiet stamp of a clerk's seal. There were no rings, no kisses, No witnesses besides Harold and the law. When it was over, Daniel slipped the marriage certificate into a leather folder and turned to her. "Welcome to the arrangement." She crossed her arms. "You make it sound like a prison sentence. Only if you fight it," he said. "Come." The car's waiting. They drove in silence to his estate, a mansion outside the city that looked like it belonged in another century. The driveway curved through manicured gardens, fountains, and marble statues that gleamed even under the grey sky. Emily stared out the window, overwhelmed. "This is where I'll live?" she asked quietly. "Yes. It feels empty." "That's because it is," he said, his voice flat. When they entered, she understood what he meant. The house was perfect, grand, symmetrical, and lifeless. No photos, no warmth, no sign that anyone truly lived there. He showed her to a guest suite on the east wing. "You'll have your privacy," he said. "Meals are at 7. You don't have to join me. Do you always eat alone?" "Always." She hesitated. "That's sad." He looked at her, something flickering behind his eyes. "It's efficient." That night, Emily stood by the window of her new room, watching rain streak down the glass. The city lights shimmered in the distance, a world she no longer belonged to. Somewhere in the West Wing, Daniel sat at his piano, playing softly, a haunting melody that carried through the halls. She closed her eyes and listened. For the first time, she saw the man behind the contract. Not the millionaire, not the machine, but the lonely heart that had forgotten what it meant to be touched by something real. And without meaning to, she whispered to herself, "What did I just step into?" Down the hall, the music stopped, as if he'd heard her. The following mornings settled into an uneasy rhythm. Emily would wake early, drawn by the quiet hum of a house that seemed to hold its breath. The maids moved silently, the chef worked without sound, and even the ticking of the antique clocks felt hesitant. It was a world of perfection without life, a museum of solitude built by a man afraid to feel. At breakfast, Daniel sat at the far end of a table long enough to seat 20. Between them, untouched plates and an ocean of silence. He read the financial pages, while she stirred her tea just to hear something move. "Do you ever talk during meals?" she asked one morning, her voice startling even herself. He glanced up briefly. "When there's something to say. You're not very good at small talk, are you?" "I prefer precision," he said. "Words are expensive when used carelessly." She gave a small, amused laugh. "And yet you spent a fortune buying silence." For the first time he looked up for real. The corner of his mouth twitched. "You're bolder than you were at the diner." "I was working for tips. Now I'm apparently married to one." That earned her the faintest trace of a smile before he folded the paper. "Eat before it gets cold." She noticed then the small ways he avoided people, how he'd time his meals to miss the staff, how he'd walk through the house as though each room belonged to a memory he didn't wish to disturb. Later that afternoon, wandering through the West Wing, she found a locked door. Its handle was brass, worn smooth, unlike the others. Curiosity tugged at her. "Don't go in there." His voice came from behind her, quiet but firm. She turned to see him in the doorway, watching her with an unreadable expression. "I didn't know you were there. You shouldn't be here. What's inside?" He hesitated. "Something I'm not ready to remember." Her gaze softened. "Everyone has ghosts, Daniel." He said nothing, but the shadow in his eyes deepened. "Dinner's at 7. When he left, she lingered in the hall a moment longer, feeling the pull of that closed door like gravity. Then she walked away. In the evenings, she'd hear the piano again, always the same melody, quiet, deliberate, heartbreak wrapped in discipline, the kind of music that sounded like someone trying not to cry. One night she followed the sound. The West Hall was dimly lit, lined with portraits, none of them recent. At the end, she found him at the grand piano, sleeves rolled to his forearms, his fingers moving with surgical precision. He didn't see her at first. She stood quietly until he stopped playing. "I didn't mean to interrupt," she said softly. He turned, startled, the walls around him snapping back into place. "You didn't." "I was finished." It didn't sound finished. He frowned slightly, then gestured toward the instrument. "Do you play?" "A little. My mother taught me when I was younger, before life got too busy for music." "Sit," he said. She hesitated, then did. The bench was warm from where he'd been. "Go on," he said quietly. "Play something." She placed her hands on the keys. At first, she faltered, unsure of herself, but then the music found her again. Soft, unpolished, alive. When she finished, she looked up and saw something unguarded in his expression, something almost tender. "That," he said after a moment, is what music is supposed to sound like. She smiled faintly. Imperfect, human. They sat in silence, the word hanging between them. For a moment, the mansion didn't feel empty. It felt paused, as if listening. Over the next weeks, something in their arrangement began to shift. It wasn't affection, not yet, but familiarity. He started leaving the study door open. She stopped announcing her presence before entering a room. Sometimes he'd ask her opinion on trivial matters, like a piece of artwork or which wine to serve. It wasn't much, but it was more than nothing. One afternoon, she found him in the library, surrounded by old books and unopened letters. "Are these yours?" she asked. "They were my father's," he said without looking up. "You never read them?" "I don't need to. I already know what they say." "Maybe you should read one anyway," she said softly. "Sometimes closure doesn't come from knowing. It comes from hearing it again." He stared at her, something flickering in his gaze, a mixture of resistance and recognition. That night, he opened one. The letter was dated 15 years ago, written in his father's slanted handwriting. It wasn't about business. It was about regret, about how losing his wife had turned him into a man who valued control more than love, money more than people. Daniel read it 3 times. He didn't cry, but he didn't sleep either. In the morning, Emily found the letter on the table beside her coffee, folded neatly beside a single note in his own handwriting. "Maybe you were right," she smiled, small, almost secret, and slipped it into her apron pocket. The next day, he joined her for breakfast uninvited. "Your coffee is terrible," he said after taking a sip. She laughed. "Then why drink it?" "Because it's the only thing here that feels real." For a long time, neither spoke again, but it wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was the silence of 2 people standing at the edge of something they didn't yet understand, something fragile, terrifying, and alive. And in that silence, both of them knew. The house was beginning to echo again. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, the mansion began to breathe again. It wasn't something Daniel noticed at first. It was the staff who whispered about it. How laughter had returned to the kitchen, how sunlight seemed to last longer in the halls, how Mr. Hawthorne, the man whose presence once froze the air, now lingered a moment longer at breakfast before disappearing into his study. It was Emily. She didn't try to change things, she simply existed differently. She opened curtains that had stayed closed for years. She baked when she was nervous and left the smell of cinnamon in rooms that hadn't known warmth. She spoke kindly to everyone, from the gardener to the driver, and they responded to her as though she'd lifted an invisible weight from the house. One afternoon, Daniel came downstairs to find her kneeling in the foyer, arranging fresh flowers in a tall crystal vase. She didn't notice him watching. Her hands moved carefully, deliberately, as though beauty were a responsibility. "You don't have to do that," he said finally. She looked up, startled. "I know. I wanted to." He studied her for a long moment. "You change things without asking. Would you rather I didn't?" He hesitated. "I don't know yet." She smiled faintly. "Then I'll keep doing it until you decide." Later that evening, when he entered the library, he noticed something different. The air smelled faintly of vanilla. The curtains were drawn open, revealing the sunset, and on the piano, a single photograph, one of his parents, stood upright for the first time in years. He paused, staring at it. "I found it in a drawer," she said from the doorway. It felt wrong hiding them away. His voice was quiet. "My father couldn't look at it after she died. Neither could I." She nodded gently. "Grief doesn't go away when you hide it, Daniel. It just waits." For a long time, he said nothing. Then, almost to himself, he murmured, "You sound like her." "Your mother?" "Yes," he said, and walked away before she could see the emotion gathering behind his eyes. That night, he didn't play the piano. But the next morning, she woke to music again. Slower this time, softer, as though something had opened inside him. Over breakfast, she asked, "Do you ever miss what life was like before all this? Before the company, before the money?" He set down his cup. "I used to think wealth would make me untouchable, that it could buy me immunity from pain. But all it did was isolate me from everything that made life worth feeling. And what about now?" "Now," he said, "I'm not sure what I feel." Their eyes met across the table, a long, quiet moment that neither broke. Then he cleared his throat, shifting back into the armor of formality. "I have meetings today. I'll be home late." She smiled faintly. "I'll save dinner." He didn't answer, but when he left, she saw the smallest trace of something new in him, hesitation. That evening, she waited. The rain returned, drumming softly against the windows. By 10 o'clock, she gave up, setting his untouched plate aside. As she turned to leave, the sound of the front door opening startled her. Daniel walked in soaked, exhausted, but carrying something unexpected, a bag of groceries. "You went shopping?" she asked, incredulous. "I did," he said simply. "I wanted to try cooking." She laughed, covering her mouth. "You in the kitchen? Don't look so surprised. I'm quite capable of burning things." It was the first time she'd heard him tease himself. He rolled up his sleeves, and together they began the clumsy experiment of dinner. He was awkward, meticulous, almost surgical in his precision. When he spilled sauce on his cuff, she laughed so hard she nearly dropped the spoon. "Stop smiling like that," he said, trying not to laugh himself. "Like what? Like you've just seen a miracle." "Maybe I have," she said softly. For a second, the world stilled. Their hands brushed as they reached for the same bowl, and both froze. The air shifted, warm, electric. Neither spoke, neither moved. But in that moment, something silent and irreversible passed between them. When they finally ate, the food was terrible, but neither cared. They talked about small things, ordinary things. She told him about her mother's illness, her old apartment, the things she still wanted to study. He listened, really listened, and she saw the man beneath the armor, the one who'd forgotten how to be human. Afterward, as she gathered the plates, he stopped her. "Emily," she turned. "Yes," he hesitated, searching for words. "You've made this house unfamiliar. Is that good or bad?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I haven't decided yet." The next morning, she found a new flower arrangement on the table. Lilies, her favorite, though she'd never told him that. She smiled, realizing that somewhere between silence and small talk, distance and closeness, their arrangement had begun to crumble into something dangerously real. And when she heard the piano that night, the melody different now, fuller, alive, she knew the air in the house had truly changed, but she didn't yet know how much it would cost them both. Autumn began to settle over the city, bringing with it a kind of melancholy beauty that seemed to echo through every corner of the Hawthorne estate. The trees on the grounds turned shades of amber and crimson, their reflection trembling in the stillness of the lake beyond the terrace. Inside, everything looked the same, yet nothing felt the same anymore. Emily and Daniel had fallen into a rhythm that neither could explain. It wasn't the routine of two people bound by obligation, nor was it romance, not yet. It was something quieter, more dangerous, an intimacy born not from touch, but from being seen. One morning, she found him in the greenhouse. The glass walls were fogged with condensation, sunlight filtering through leaves heavy with dew. He stood among the orchids, his suit jacket off, sleeves rolled, watering a plant with quiet precision. "I didn't know you came here," she said, stepping inside. He didn't look up. "I used to come with my mother. She said it was the only place in the house that remembered how to breathe." She smiled faintly. "And you kept it alive all these years?" He paused, his hand tightening around the watering can. "No, I hired someone to keep it alive. I couldn't bring myself to come back until now." She walked closer, brushing her fingers against a petal. "It's beautiful. You can almost feel her here." For a moment, his expression softened. "That's why it hurts." Their eyes met, a brief, fragile connection, before he turned away, setting the can down too carefully. "You should get ready. There's a charity event tonight. My assistant will arrange a dress." "Do I have to go?" "Yes," he said. "You're Mrs. Hawthorne now." The words struck her unexpectedly. She'd signed them on paper, worn them like a title, but hearing them out loud, it was different. She nodded silently and left. That evening, the mansion came alive in a way it hadn't in months. Cars lined the drive, voices filled the halls, and the air shimmered with wealth. Emily stood near the staircase, the dress his assistant had chosen fitting her like a second skin. Simple, elegant, unpretentious. Exactly her. When Daniel saw her, something in him faltered. He covered it with a practiced calm, but his gaze lingered longer than it should have. "You clean up well," he said. She smiled. "So do you, for someone who hates parties." "I don't hate them," he replied. "I just hate everyone in them." She laughed softly. "That's almost romantic." Throughout the night, she watched him move through the crowd, composed, charming but distant. People admired him, envied him, whispered about him. Yet none of them saw what she saw. The man who watered flowers in silence, who played piano when no one was watching, who looked like he'd forgotten how to belong anywhere. A woman approached her, tall, polished, and smiling with the kind of sharpness that comes from habit. "You must be the new Mrs. Hawthorne," she said. "I'm Clarissa, Daniel's ex-fiancée." Emily froze. "Oh, I didn't know he was—" Clarissa's smile didn't reach her eyes. "You wouldn't. He doesn't like talking about the past or the truth." "I'm not sure what you mean." "I mean," Clarissa said, tilting her glass, "Daniel doesn't marry for love. He marries for convenience." "I'm guessing you're convenient." Emily's pulse quickened, but she kept her composure. "And yet he didn't choose you." Clarissa's eyes flashed, the smile fading for a moment before returning sharper. "Enjoy it while it lasts, darling. He always finds a reason to leave." Emily turned away, her chest tight. She found Daniel near the balcony, speaking with investors, his expression unreadable. When he caught her looking, he excused himself and approached. "Something wrong?" She shook her head, forcing a smile. "Just adjusting." But later, in the car ride home, she finally asked, "Did you ever love her?" He was silent for a long time before answering. "I thought I did, but it wasn't love. It was what people call love when they don't know what else to name the emptiness." She turned to him. "And what about now?" He looked out the window, rain streaking across the glass. "Now I'm not sure I'd recognize love if it stood right in front of me." Neither spoke again until they reached home. That night Emily couldn't sleep. Clarissa's words echoed in her mind, twisting around her heart like vines. "He doesn't marry for love." She got up, wandering through the halls until she reached the west wing, the one he'd told her to avoid. The locked door was still there, silent and unyielding. She hesitated only a second before turning the handle. To her surprise, it opened. Inside was a room preserved in time. Photographs lined the walls. Daniel's parents, a younger version of himself, and a woman she didn't recognize. The space smelled faintly of old perfume and dust. On a small table sat a music box, its lid open, its tune broken by age. She turned, startled, as his voice came from behind her. "I told you not to come here." He stood in the doorway, face pale, eyes shadowed. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I couldn't sleep. I needed to understand. There's nothing here for you to understand." "That's not true. There's everything here." She took a step closer. "Who was she?" He looked at the photograph she'd been staring at. "My sister. She died when I was 20. This was her room." Her breath caught. "I didn't know." "No one does," he said quietly. "I don't talk about her. I don't talk about anything that hurts." "And has that worked?" He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time, the walls inside him cracked. "No," he whispered. "It hasn't." She stepped closer, her voice soft. "You can't keep carrying it alone, Daniel." He exhaled, closing his eyes. "You think you can fix me." "I don't want to fix you," she said gently. "I just want you to remember, you're human." The silence that followed was heavy, trembling. He turned away before she could see the tears he refused to shed. "Go to bed, Emily." She didn't argue. But as she left the room, she heard the faint sound of the music box starting again, a broken tune struggling to play, just like the man who stood inside it. The days that followed were quieter, not with peace, but with the fragile stillness that comes after something deep has cracked. Daniel had withdrawn again, the door to his sister's room locked once more. Emily didn't ask questions. She knew when to give silence the dignity it required. Yet something between them had shifted irreversibly, the kind of shift that happens when you've seen someone's pain and can't unsee it. He spent more time in his study, working late into the night, the blue glow of his computer painting the windows. She went about her routine, watering plants, reading in the library, leaving fresh flowers where he'd pass by. They barely spoke, yet the air between them was heavier than ever, thick with words unsaid. One evening she found herself outside the music room again. The piano was silent, its cover closed. For a long moment she stood there, then lifted the lid. Her fingers touched the keys. The melody came uninvited, the same one he used to play. She played it softly, uncertainly. Halfway through she heard the door open behind her. "You remember it," he said. She froze, her fingers still. I didn't say stop," he murmured, stepping closer. He leaned against the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You play differently than I do." "How so?" "You don't play to forget. You play to feel." Her eyes met his. "Maybe that's what you need." He looked at her for a long time, then came to stand beside her. His hand brushed hers as he pressed a single key, low, resonant, imperfect. "I don't remember how," he said softly. She turned toward him. "Then let me remind you." For a moment, neither moved. The air was electric, golden light flickering through the rain-streaked windows. She started the melody again, slower this time, her hand moving beside his. He hesitated, then joined her. The two of them played together, not perfectly, not even rhythmically, but honestly. The sound that filled the room wasn't music, it was confession. When the final note faded, neither spoke. He looked down at their hands, still resting on the keys, still trembling slightly, and then up at her. "You've turned this house into something I don't recognize anymore," he said. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe it's dangerous," he said quietly. "You've made me feel things I don't know how to manage." She swallowed, her pulse quickening. "You don't have to manage them. You just have to admit they're real." He took a slow breath, as though trying to steady the ground beneath him. "When I married you, I thought I was buying time. I didn't realize I was giving it back to myself." Her heart caught. "Daniel." He looked at her, the cold in his eyes melting into something raw, something human. "I can't remember the last time I looked at someone and didn't see what they wanted from me. Until you." She took a step closer. "And what do you see now?" He hesitated. "Everything I never thought I could have." The space between them disappeared. His hand rose, slow, uncertain, as though he was afraid she might vanish if he touched her. When his fingers brushed her cheek, the world fell silent. She could feel his heartbeat in the distance between them, that thin, trembling air, charged with something neither had planned for. "Emily," he whispered, her name a confession. Her voice was barely audible. "You shouldn't." "I know." And still, he kissed her. It wasn't the kind of kiss that belonged to a man who wanted control. It was the desperate kind, the kind that tasted like surrender. Years of restraint dissolved in seconds. She felt him tremble against her, as though the weight of everything he'd built was collapsing into her hands. When he finally pulled back, they both stood still, breathing hard, eyes locked. "This wasn't part of the arrangement," she said softly. "Neither was feeling alive again," he replied. She stepped away, her heart pounding, torn between what she wanted and what she feared. "If this is just loneliness, Daniel." "It's not," he said quickly. "I've known loneliness all my life. This is different." But before she could answer, a knock echoed from the hallway. Harold entered, his face pale. "Daniel, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have a problem." Daniel's jaw tightened. "What kind of problem?" "It's the trust. There's a clause you missed. Your father's lawyers are contesting the marriage. They're claiming fraud." Emily blinked. "Fraud?" Harold nodded grimly. "They're saying it's a marriage of convenience, that it violates the spirit of the will. If they succeed, you lose everything." Daniel's eyes hardened, his expression shifting back to the man he used to be. "How long do we have?" "Days," Harold said. "Maybe less." Emily turned to him, stunned. "They can't do that, can they?" "They can if they prove it wasn't real," Daniel said quietly. "If they prove you never loved me." Her chest tightened. "And do you?" He looked at her, emotion warring behind his eyes. "That's the problem. I don't know how to prove it. Not to them. Not even to myself." The silence that followed was deafening. When Harold left, Emily stood there trying to find her breath. "What happens now?" He looked away, voice low. "Now? We make them believe." But she heard what he didn't say, and in doing so, we might have to destroy what's actually real. For the first time since meeting him, Emily saw fear in Daniel Hawthorne's eyes, and she understood something she hadn't before, that love and survival, in his world, were never on the same side. The following days blurred into chaos. The perfect order of Daniel's world, his schedules, his composure, his certainty, crumbled into frantic calls and endless meetings. Lawyers crowded the mansion, carrying boxes of documents and whispering about evidence, loopholes and strategy. The media had caught the scent too. Cameras now waited beyond the gates, turning every passing shadow into a headline. Emily watched it unfold like a storm she couldn't stop. She'd never seen Daniel like this. Tired, angry, cornered. He slept little, ate less. Every time she tried to speak, he'd wave her off with a strained "later," but later never came. One evening, she found him in the study, the light from the desk lamp cutting sharp lines across his face. His tie was loosened, his hands trembling slightly as he flipped through a stack of papers. "You can't fight like this forever," she said gently. He didn't look up. "If I stop fighting, I lose everything." "Everything?" she repeated. "Or just the illusion of it?" That made him pause. He finally met her gaze, exhaustion clouding his eyes. "You don't understand what it took to build all this, what it means to watch it be taken apart by people who never earned it." "You're right," she said quietly. "I don't understand that, but I do understand what it's like to lose yourself while trying to save what's already gone." He stood abruptly, turning away. "I didn't ask you to save me." "No," she said softly. "You just married me instead." The words hung between them like a blade. He exhaled, dragging a hand through his hair. "Emily, The knock at the door cut him off. Harold entered, his expression grim. "It's worse than we thought. They've found the contract." Daniel froze. What?" "The original agreement," Harold said. "The one you signed with her. They got a copy. If they present it, the court will have proof this marriage began as a transaction." Emily's voice shook. "Who would have leaked it?" "Clarissa," Harold said bitterly. "She's the one who filed the complaint." Daniel's jaw clenched. "Of course she did." He turned to Emily, his tone shifting into something cold and businesslike, his armor snapping back in place. "From now on, everything we do has to look real. Every move, every word, every glance. We convinced them that this marriage became something genuine." "And what if it did?" she asked quietly. He hesitated. "Then it shouldn't be hard to prove." But the look in his eyes betrayed uncertainty, a man unsure where the lie ended and the truth began. The next week became a performance neither of them could escape. Public dinners, photo shoots, forced appearances, every moment designed to convince the world that they were in love. Cameras followed them everywhere, capturing his hand on her back, her smile tilted perfectly toward his shoulder. Yet when they were alone, the silence grew heavier. What had once been fragile closeness was now suspicion, guilt, and longing tangled in impossible ways. One night, after a charity gala staged for the press, they returned home in separate cars. Emily found him on the terrace, staring out at the city lights. "I saw the way you looked at me tonight," she said softly. "The way you held my hand like it was a script." He turned slowly, his face unreadable. "It was necessary. For them," she said. "Or for you?" He didn't answer. She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "When did pretending start to feel real, Daniel?" He took a slow breath, his composure faltering for the briefest moment. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe the night you played the piano. Maybe before that. Maybe since the first time you told me the truth and didn't care who I was." She wanted to reach for him, but the distance between them was no longer physical. It was made of fear. "Then tell them," she said, voice breaking. "Tell them what this really is. Tell them you fell in love." His expression hardened again. "Love doesn't win court cases, Emily." "Maybe not," she whispered, "but it's the only thing worth losing one for." He looked away, his silence louder than any argument. The next morning, the hearing began. The room was filled with lawyers, reporters, and family representatives. Daniel sat beside her, immaculate and distant, while the opposing counsel painted a picture of greed and deception, of a billionaire who manipulated the law and a waitress who sold her vows. Every word sliced deeper than she expected. She tried to hold her head high, but when they read aloud the contract, her name, her signature, the shame burned through her like fire. "Miss Carter," the lawyer asked coldly, "did you or did you not agree to marry Mr. Hawthorne for financial compensation?" Her voice barely held. "I did." The room rippled with murmurs. She could feel Daniel tense beside her. "But you lived together," the lawyer continued. "You dined together, appear in public together. Are you asking this court to believe that a business arrangement magically turned into love?" Emily hesitated. The truth trembled on her tongue. If she lied, she'd save him. If she told the truth, she'd save herself. Daniel's voice cut through the silence. "Yes," he said firmly. "That's exactly what I'm asking them to believe." Every head turned toward him. He stood, his voice steady, his eyes on her. "When I met her, it was business," he said. "But what she gave me wasn't part of any deal. She gave me something I didn't even know I was missing." "Mr. Hawthorne," the lawyer said sharply, "are you suggesting you fell in love with this woman?" Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "I'm not suggesting it. I'm admitting it." A stunned hush filled the courtroom. Emily's breath caught, tears rising before she could stop them. But the opposing side wasn't done. "And what about her?" the lawyer pressed. "Did she fall in love with you?" Daniel turned to her slowly, as if afraid of what she might say. Emily looked back at him, her heart breaking under the weight of the question. The room waited. Cameras clicked. "Yes," she said finally, her voice trembling, "but not with the man who made that contract. I fell in love with the one who learned to tear it up." The silence that followed wasn't judgment. It was disbelief, the kind born not from scandal, but from witnessing something real. And in that moment, Daniel realized the truth he'd been running from. He hadn't married her to fulfill his father's will. He'd done it to fulfill his own. But the verdict hadn't been read yet. And love, as both of them were about to learn, was never enough to stop the world from taking what it wanted. The next days unfolded under the harsh light of scrutiny. The hearing wasn't over. The press had turned the case into a public spectacle. The billionaire and the waitress, a love or a lie. Headlines filled with photos of them leaving the courthouse hand in hand, her eyes downcast, his jaw set like stone. Every word they said was dissected, every silence misinterpreted. Behind the gates of the estate, the world went quiet again. Too quiet. The lawyers came and went. Harold spoke of appeals, filings, delays. Daniel listened, nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. Emily noticed the difference. He'd stopped playing the piano. He'd stopped eating dinner with her. The distance that had once defined them returned, heavier now, not born of indifference but of fear. One night she found him in the study, sitting in the dark with a single glass of whiskey. Papers lay scattered across the desk, legal drafts, financial reports, but among them, a small envelope. "What's that?" she asked quietly. He didn't look up. "My father's will, the original one." She stepped closer. "What are you doing?" He ran a hand through his hair, tired and unguarded. "Reading what I've been fighting for, and realizing I don't even want it anymore." "Then let it go," she said softly. He laughed bitterly. "You make it sound simple." "It is," she replied. "You're just afraid of who you'll be without it." He looked up sharply, her words landing too close to the truth. "And who would that be?" "The man I met at the diner," she said. "The one who didn't need to prove anything." For a moment the anger drained from him, leaving only exhaustion. He leaned back, staring at her with a quiet ache. "You don't understand, Emily. This life, it's all I've ever known. Power, control, appearances. It's how I survived." She moved closer, her voice low but steady. "Surviving isn't living, Daniel." He stared at her, his defenses cracking again. Then suddenly he said, "Leave." She froze. "What?" "Go," he said, standing now. "You've done enough. You've given enough. If they take everything, I don't want you to be dragged down with me." She shook her head. "I'm not leaving you. This isn't your fight. It became my fight the moment I said yes." He turned away, gripping the edge of the desk. "You don't understand. If they win, I lose everything." "Then let it be everything," she whispered. "Just don't lose yourself again." He didn't answer. The following morning, Emily woke to find him gone. Harold called an hour later. "He's in the city," he said, "trying to settle with the board privately. He thinks if he relinquishes the inheritance, they'll drop the charges." Emily's heart sank. "He's giving up his father's legacy." "Everything," Harold said quietly. "He said he was tired of fighting ghosts." She didn't think. She just grabbed her coat and left. When she found him, it was raining, a torrential storm that blurred the city into streaks of grey. Daniel stood on the steps of the courthouse, talking to reporters. His suit was soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead, but his voice was steady. "Let them have it," he said. "The trust, the company, the name. I won't spend another day proving to people that money defines worth." "Mr. Hawthorne," someone shouted, "does this mean your marriage was a fraud?" He looked up, eyes fierce. "It means my marriage was the only honest thing I've ever done." The crowd erupted in questions, flashes exploding like lightning. Emily stepped forward through the chaos, her clothes drenched, her hands shaking. "Daniel!" she called out. He turned, and for a second the noise disappeared. The rain fell harder. The world narrowed to just them. "What are you doing?" she said, breathless. "You don't have to destroy everything." He shook his head. "It's already gone." "Not everything," she said. "Not me." He stared at her, the weight of exhaustion giving way to something softer. "Surrender. You shouldn't have come. I couldn't stay away." He stepped closer, the rain between them glimmering under the lights. "You'll hate me when this is over." She took his hand. "Then let me decide when that happens." That night, the story broke worldwide. Daniel Hawthorne renounces fortune, cites love as reason. The media spun it as madness. Investors called it suicide. But for the first time in years, Daniel slept. In the morning, the mansion felt different. The staff was gone. The power dynamics dissolved. He sat at the piano again, and when Emily entered, he looked up, almost smiling. "I used to think losing everything was failure," he said. "Now it feels like freedom." She sat beside him. "Then play something for it." He did, and the melody that filled the house wasn't sorrow this time. It was gratitude. But freedom, they would soon learn, comes with a price. Later that afternoon, as they walked through the garden, Harold arrived in his car, his face pale. "Daniel," he said, voice trembling, "you need to see this." He handed him a tablet. On the screen was a headline that made Emily's stomach drop. Whistleblower leaks private contract. Waitress admits marriage for money. Below it, photos of her signature, excerpts from her old debt records and speculation that she'd blackmailed him into marriage. Daniel's face went cold. Who leaked this? Clarissa again, Harold said. She's saying you were manipulated. Emily's heart pounded. Daniel, I didn't... He cut her off, his voice strained with fury and disbelief. Not here. Not now. Her chest tightened. You don't believe that, do you? He didn't answer. She took a step closer. Daniel, look at me. You know who I am. He stared at her for a long time, too long, and the silence between them was worse than any accusation. Then he said quietly, I thought I did. The world around them blurred, the sound of rain mixing with the breaking of something far deeper. And for the first time since she entered his life, Emily felt what it was like to be truly alone inside his silence. The next morning, the world had already decided who Emily Carter was. News anchors called her a liar. Headlines used words like gold digger, fraud, deceiver. Her face was everywhere, on TV, on magazines, across social media, each photo cropped to make her look guilty, calculating, cold. Overnight, the waitress who had once gone unnoticed became the most hated woman in New York. Inside the mansion, she sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the phone buzzing endlessly on the nightstand. Messages poured in, reporters demanding comments, strangers sending insults, friends too afraid to answer her calls. Her hands trembled as she read the latest headline. Hawthorne scandal deepens. Wife's debt records reveal the truth. The truth. She almost laughed. The truth was buried beneath layers of noise no one cared to peel back. Downstairs, she could hear Daniel's voice, low, sharp, furious. He was on a call, pacing the study floor. I told you to shut it down. I don't care what it costs. I don't care who you have to pay off. I want her name cleared. He slammed the phone down, the sound echoing through the house. When Emily appeared in the doorway, he turned, startled. He hadn't realized she was listening. You shouldn't have to do this, she said quietly. His jaw tightened. You shouldn't have to live like this. But I am, she said. And maybe it's better that way. Maybe this is the universe putting things back where they belong. Don't, he said sharply. Don't talk like that. Like what? Like you were never enough. Her eyes filled, but her voice stayed steady. Because I'm not, Daniel. I never was. You don't have to say it. I can see it every time you look at me now. That's not true. She took a step closer. Then tell me it isn't. He froze. The silence stretched too long, and she saw it. The hesitation, the doubt he couldn't hide. Her heart broke cleanly, quietly. That's what I thought. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. Where will you go? I don't know, she said softly, but anywhere's better than staying somewhere I've already been tried and convicted. When the door closed behind her, Daniel stood still, the emptiness pressing against him like gravity. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to do. Every instinct screamed to control, to fix, to fight. But how do you fight a storm made of words and half-truths when you no longer know what's real? For 3 days, Emily disappeared. Reporters camped outside, hoping to catch her return, but she was gone. The city swallowed her. Its crowds, its noise, its indifference. She stayed in a small motel by the river, living on silence and black coffee, watching her own name flash across the TV like a stranger's. One evening, a knock came at the door. When she opened it, Evelyn Hawthorne stood there, Daniel's mother. May I come in? The older woman asked gently. Emily hesitated, then stepped aside. Evelyn's presence was calm, deliberate, the kind of grace that commanded without trying. She looked around the tiny room and sighed. You don't belong here. Neither do I belong in his world, Emily replied. Evelyn smiled faintly. Neither did I once. But love doesn't ask where you belong, it asks what you're willing to endure. Emily's eyes welled. Endure. The world hates me. They think I used him. Did you? No, she said fiercely. I loved him. Then endure that truth, Evelyn said simply. Because if you walk away from it, the world wins, and you'll spend the rest of your life trying to forget a man who already changed you. Emily turned away, her throat tight. He doesn't believe in me anymore. Evelyn reached into her coat and pulled out a small envelope, then let him prove otherwise. Inside was a letter, handwritten in Daniel's familiar scrawl. If you read this, it means I failed to find you first. I don't know how to make the world see the truth, but I do know what I've become without you. A man who finally understands that love is not something you earn, it's something you protect. Emily pressed the letter to her chest, her tears silent. Evelyn stood, resting a hand on her shoulder. Come home, she said softly. For him or for yourself, it doesn't matter which, as long as you don't let fear decide. When Emily returned 2 days later, the mansion was surrounded by cameras, reporters shouting her name. But she didn't stop. She walked straight through them, head high, shoulders steady, as if daring the world to keep throwing stones. Inside, she found Daniel sitting at the piano. He looked up, disbelief flickering across his face. "You came back." "I didn't run," she said. "Not from you." He stood slowly, his voice quiet but unsteady. "I don't deserve that." "Probably not," she said, a faint smile ghosting her lips. But love was never about deserving. He crossed the room in 2 strides and stopped just in front of her, his eyes searching hers for forgiveness he didn't think he could ask for. "I didn't believe them," he said. "I doubted myself. That's worse." "You did," she whispered. "But you're here now." He reached out, his hand trembling as it brushed her cheek. "Emily, I don't know how to fix this." She looked up at him, her voice soft but strong. "You don't have to fix it, you just have to stop hiding from it." The house was silent, except for the faint sound of rain beginning again outside, their constant companion. He leaned in, resting his forehead against hers. "They'll never stop talking," he murmured. "Let them," she said. "We know the truth." He pulled her closer, their silence becoming its own kind of vow. For the first time there was no wealth, no will, no performance, just 2 people who had been stripped of everything, except what mattered. Outside, flashbulbs lit the night like lightning, capturing the moment that would make the front page again. The Waitress returns. But this time the story wouldn't be about scandal. It would be about something rarer, something real. And as Daniel whispered her name against her hair, the storm outside finally began to quiet. The court reconvened one final time on a grey morning that smelled of rain and consequence. Daniel and Emily sat side by side at the long oak table, surrounded by lawyers, cameras, and the cold judgment of 100 curious eyes. But this time, they weren't hiding behind performance. There was no script, no strategy, just truth, raw and unpolished, ready to be heard. The opposing counsel began again, their voices sharp and clinical. "Your marriage was a legal arrangement, Mr. Hawthorne. It began as a transaction. Do you deny that?" Daniel's voice was steady. "No, I don't." A murmur rippled through the room. Emily's hands tightened around her lap, but he continued, calm and certain. "I don't deny how it started," he said, "but I deny what you say it became. I married her because I thought I needed to satisfy a condition in my father's will. What I didn't realize was that she would become the only condition that ever mattered." The judge watched him silently, expression unreadable. "Are you telling this court you fell in love with her?" Daniel looked toward Emily, his voice softening. "I'm not telling the court. I'm telling her. Yes, I did, completely." The courtroom went still. Every camera flashed, every whisper stopped. "And Ms. Carter," the lawyer asked, turning to her, "what about you? Did you love him, or did you see an opportunity?" Emily stood slowly, her voice calm but trembling with emotion. "I saw a man who didn't know how to feel anymore. I saw someone who measured everything by numbers and signatures because it was safer than being human. And I loved him, not because he was rich, because for a moment he forgot he was." Her words hung in the air like light breaking through storm clouds. Even the judge leaned back, thoughtful. After a long pause, the verdict was read. The marriage would stand. The charges were dropped. The inheritance, irrelevant now, was legally his, though Daniel barely listened. All he heard was the sound of her breathing beside him, steady, real, alive. When they walked out of the courthouse, the cameras surged again, but something in their faces silenced even the crowd. They weren't 2 people defending themselves anymore. They were 2 people who had already chosen each other, no matter the cost. That evening, they returned to the mansion for the last time. The place no longer felt like home. It was a monument to everything they'd survived. The air was still but not empty. It felt like closure. In the quiet, Emily walked through each room, touching the spaces that had once felt cold. The library, the hall, the piano. She stopped at the west wing in front of the locked door to his sister's room. Daniel joined her, silent. "She'd like you," he said quietly. "You have her stubbornness." Emily smiled faintly. "Then she must have been impossible." "She was," he said, "but she loved the world too much to let it harden her. You remind me of that." He unlocked the door and let her in. The room smelled faintly of old roses and dust. On the nightstand sat a photograph of his family, his father, his mother, his sister. He picked it up and turned it toward her. I used to think I could only honor them by keeping their world alive. Now I realize the only way to honor them is to finally live mine." Emily looked up at him, tears glimmering in her eyes. "Then let's start there." They spent the next morning packing only what mattered. The rest, the mansion, the staff, the cars, would stay behind. They didn't belong to that world anymore. When the last box was closed, Daniel turned to her. "Where do we go?" she asked. He smiled, something unguarded and boyish in the way it softened his face. "Anywhere there's noise and bad coffee." She laughed, shaking her head. "So nowhere fancy." "I've had enough of fancy," he said. "I just want real." As they drove away, the city opened before them, wide and uncertain. The storm had passed, leaving the streets washed clean. For once, there were no photographers, no headlines, no expectations, just a man and a woman beginning again. Months later, they bought a small cafe by the river. It wasn't much, peeling paint, crooked shelves, but it was theirs. Emily managed the counter, Daniel worked the books, and the place filled with laughter, warmth, and people who didn't care who they used to be. Sometimes, regulars would glance at him and whisper, "He looks familiar," but Daniel never confirmed it. He didn't need to. In the evenings, when the cafe closed, he'd sit at the old upright piano by the window and play. Emily would wipe down tables, humming softly to the melody. And when she came to sit beside him, he'd lean close and say the same words every night. "You saved me," he'd whisper, and she'd smile, touching his hand. "No, Daniel, you finally let yourself be found." Outside, the lights reflected on the river, shimmering gold and silver like promises reborn. The world had taken everything from them once, but in losing it all, they'd discovered what it meant to own something no one could touch. Not money, not legacy, just love. Real, imperfect, human love. Subscribe to be part of stories that remind you that love, when it's true, never needs to be bought. It only needs to be chosen.